Greetings and welcome to a very special presentation. This is Yorke on Games number 42, continuation of the article series on the philosophy of games that I began some number of years ago, now heading to the vodcast format. My name is Dr. Christopher C. Yorke. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Zagreb in Croatia, and today I'm here to give an introductory lecture on the dialectics and ethics of opposition for the Secrets of Strixhaven tournament for the Arena Gauntlet League. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak to this audience, as magic and philosophy have both been long-standing interests of mine. I'm always very glad when I get a chance to bring the two together. This is a fairly short presentation, so without further ado, let's begin. So here we have the title slide, The Ethics of Opposition, Why Good Opponents Are Better Than Good Neighbors. That might sound surprising to you, given that obstacles that the opposition bring up in games and in life can often be troublesome, confounding, hurtful, confusing, and so on and so forth. I'm going to try to show the other side of the coin here and explain why the kinds of obstacles that your opponents mount for you actually make you a better person. A better person than people who, for example, just agree with you and try to get along with you all the time. Let's begin with a little bit of religion. Here I've listed as metaphysics, really. So obviously in Taoism, you have the idea of the yin and the yang, the idea that there are two elemental forces in the universe, light and dark, and they're struggling against each other. This becomes also one of the main tenets of Christianity, right? You have the forces of good and the forces of evil. You have God and Satan. They're both fighting for the soul of the human being, and it's our job to use our free will to try to negotiate that challenge and come up with the right spiritual answer. And Manichaeism as well is another philosophy, now I think largely abandoned since the 13th century, which has the same underlying metaphysical principle, which is that there's darkness and there's light, and the idea is that the light is eventually fading from the universe, and darkness is taking over. It's a bit of a downer, I think. But the idea here, right, is that if we have a force that we can identify as being opposite from ourselves, we can fight against it. It gives us a reason to do something rather than do nothing, which is we saw the world as a sort of holistic unity. There might not be that dramatic tension, right? So there's something about opposition that's very fundamental to human belief structures, religions, and philosophies. How does this get brought into our contemporary world? Well, there's something I suppose I would identify as the politics of opposition, and this is quite a rogues gallery of resources here. The existentialist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had this idea that there was the Übermensch, who was the strong person who didn't follow the rules of society, who was able to project their values into the world and fight for them against other people who were also similarly strong and similarly possessed of values that they would like to push forward. And according to Nietzsche, culture is created by this struggle, by the clash of these big ideas championed by strong Übermensch. And the alternative to him was a kind of unthinkable stultification of culture, a slave morality of people who were just good neighbors and who just agreed with each other all the time. That's where he lumped the Christians. So even though his politics, if you will, have something in common with Christianity, is that this dialectic of opposition, he identifies Christianity as a religion where people are just trying to get along, so it doesn't have the creative, vibrant energy that he thinks that the creation of culture needs. So historically, of course, Nietzsche's ideas were picked up by the Nazi Party, and that, by many accounts, was something that he would have been personally against. We have a legal theorist around the same time that in Germany called Carl Schmitt, and he had this idea that there basically is no group of people that can politically exist as a nation or a country without this distinction between a friend and a foe, or an us and a them, more or less. And therefore, that the strength of any group of people, or let's say movement, political or otherwise, is predicated on the kinds of opposition that it fields. And of course, we see this in Magic's color wheel, right? We see that essentially parasitism on the color wheel is across from interdependence, right? So if you want to define yourself by chaos, you put yourself in opposition to those that are defending order, and the more values that you choose, the more opposite values that you have to contend with. All right. So the game that we're talking about today, Magic the Gathering, kind of has this politics of opposition already built into its color wheel. Making a bit of a departure from the continent, well, not exactly a departure, but a sort of broadening of the sphere of influence here. We can see that all the way back in ancient Greece, right? We had Socrates and his Socratic dialogue, and he was pointing to the fact that, well, we can't really have an honest investigation to try to find the philosophical truth on any matter unless we have a foil or a theoretical opponent, an interlocutor that we can speak with, who will earnestly question our statements and make us, question ourselves and become more earnest intellectual seekers. So let's call this the dialectics of opposition. Hegel had this idea, right, that the quest for truth starts out with a thesis that we test with an antithesis, right? So if I say yes and you say no, and then we come to a synthesis of maybe, that's some sort of progress towards a middle position, a middle term that we can maybe agree on or start a new investigation on. The certainty of the thesis stands in direct contrast to the certainty of the antithesis, and we cannot hold both of these in our minds at the same time, so we have to come to an intermediary position. So the idea is that by negating the synthesis, we come up with a new antithesis, which by resolving that, we come to a new synthesis, and so on and so on. And this unfolding of the Weltgeist, or the world spirit, is sort of the history of human intellectual progress. Well, that's heady stuff. In more contemporary times, right, when the works of John Stuart Mill, etc., we can see that there's this valuation of democratic debate. So here is the idea that if we have a free practice of debating and discussing, and maybe actually having different kinds of contests with each other, the best ideas or the best positions will win out. It's a kind of, I suppose, soft Nietzschean valuation of opposing viewpoints, contesting for the truth. So let's talk about what's in it for us to fight each other, right? We're in sports and games, for instance, because we value competition in one way, but what do we get out of it? Well, posing contests to each other in sports and games is actually good practice to be an active citizen and intellectual. It gives us the opportunity to question others and ourselves, and the opportunity to attempt new answers to those questions. And it gives us the reason to exercise our capacities, right? To challenge status quos that we don't like, to deal with new situations that might come up, and become better as a result. So this is sort of code for the philosophy of perfectionism. Perfectionism is the idea that moral value derives from the expression of human capacities. So if you don't have a reason to express a capacity, we often don't. And so it's good for us to dive into opposition in order to help us find out about ourselves, find our limits and our talents, and exploit those to the fullest. So a well-functioning democracy, for example, gives us the goods of opposition. It lets us become more than what we would be if we weren't allowed to participate politically. And it's the same, again, in sports and games. So here there's some pictures which you probably recognize. The Battle of the Sexes with Billie Jean King and Kobe versus Shaq on the court, and Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling in the Olympics in Berlin. Here we have representations of different kinds of rivalries. And you might say that these rivalries, they're resolved within sports and games, but they're so much bigger than that, right? They shape the narratives of and the careers of individual players, the history of the game, and they even symbolize clashes between nations, sexes, and races and ideologies. The whole thing is there to sort of be seen. Now, this is generally seen to be a good thing, that people are able to sort of work out rivalries in this kind of semi-cooperative manner, right, of playing sports and games. If we are dealing with things on the court instead of in the streets, or in the boxing ring instead of in the streets, then this is a very productive way to both create and resolve these conflicts in a safe and let's say largely productive way. And of course, some careers are really nothing without these rivalries. And even on the server, you can see that there are certain rivalries between players in the AGL. They really want to win against each other. For example, Richard and Johnny have a long-standing rivalry where they try to knock each other out of every tournament they both play in. So that's a kind of interesting narrative that they carry on. And even though it's a friendly rivalry, you can bet that they try really hard not to get knocked out. Those games mean more, maybe, than other games that they could be playing. Let's talk about the opposite, all right? The bads of having no opposition, of having no conflict. There's this little skit in the Family Guy I've sort of taken a screen capture of here, where Wile E. Coyote finally catches the Roadrunner and then almost immediately settles into a big depression, right? And is unable to sort of function normally. So what used to give his life meaning was chasing the Roadrunner. That was his opposition. Without the Roadrunner, he has lack of purpose, he has no opportunity to grow, and he surrenders to entropy and stagnation. So the contention here is that without opposition, we have little or no reason to do the things we wouldn't normally do and become better at doing those things, which leads to a sense of existential meaninglessness, right? So if we have a reason to do something where we're tightened up, like the molecules, in a solid, and if we don't have anything, we kind of dissipate, like the molecules in a gas. If there's no principle of opposition that sort of maintains that tension, the thought is that athletes, individuals, movements crumble. And that's kind of what Schmidt was saying about political unities, right? He's saying, like, well, you need to have a them to sort of give meaning to, and us to keep the unity happening in a nation. So let's move on and talk about where all this goes wrong. Obviously, one of the reasons that I often don't teach Nietzsche to first-year philosophy students is they get a bit crazy with it, and they say, well, this justifies all sorts of things, right? It justifies violence and political oppression and silencing, doing whatever you have to do to get your message across. But I would say that this demonstrates an important limit, right? So, importantly, the goods of opposition cannot be gained if all reasonable parties are not respected, included, and guaranteed their basic safeties. This is why we have, in liberal Western democracies, laws to protect people from being unduly influenced to vote a certain way, or to, again, in theory, of course, in practice, there's lots of abuses of civil rights, but in theory, the laws are there to guarantee equal participation from all parties and to allow everybody, every citizen, to enjoy the goods of opposition without suffering from exclusion. All right. That is it for today's presentation. I thank you for your attention, and I return you to your regularly scheduled programming. This is the first in a 5-part lecture series that I will be giving over the next few weeks. And I'm going to be talking about various topics in the philosophy of sport and games, and maybe today even taking a deeper dive on what opponents can do for us, not just in games, but out with, and what it means for society. So please do join me. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Stay tuned for more. Yorke Games 43 is coming out soon.